Mr. Birdie, members of the board, we have several items for board discussion this evening. Our first item for board discussion is the bidding process for some upcoming paving projects. Recently, I had an opportunity to meet with Mrs. Lane and Mr. Berkey regarding the projects that are set to take place this summer. The projects that we are looking at in the near future include a complete overlay for crossroads. That would include a whole new parking lot and overlay and striping. And in addition, we plan on doing some crack filling at Creekside, South Elementary, and West Elementary. And we also plan to do some repairs at the bus compound as well as our high school. So put this on the agenda this evening to make you aware that we are starting that process. The bid openings for these jobs will take place on April 21st at 10 a.m. and we anticipate having this item on the board agenda for May 6th.
Okay.
Any questions on that?
Questions, comments? Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Our next item for board discussion is our book study. And just before I turn it over, the prompts we like to utilize are I read, I noticed, I wondered. And I'll turn it over to the Board of Education.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Smith. This was an amazing book. I was heavily involved with it throughout the entire process, so I'm eager to hear if anybody wants to get started on what they read, what they noticed.
I'll start. I also agree that the book was awesome. I think in this section of the book, she gets into more of some more difficult topics, I guess. But overall, I thought that, or I observed that she's consistent in her messaging throughout the book. You know, it's about fearless, daring conversations, which is kind of a similar theme from our previous book, but I thought it was pretty good. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight, it's on page 86, and I'm not sure if that's in this, is that from the last section? If so, I can, all right.
Now, we started up this section on page 75. So.
All righty, yep. Okay. So, sorry about that.
So page 86?
Page 86, yes. So this is in the section about being comfortable, be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I just highlighted one little section. I noticed this section, and it kind of stood out. Feeling uncomfortable is assurance that you are properly engaging in the growth process. And I think that's a very impactful statement. No pain, no gain. It's basically what she's saying. And, you know, that's a tougher one, a tougher concept for us, because no one wants to feel uncomfortable, but that really is where the strengthening comes from. So, just wanted to point that one out there.
I too highlighted that in my book. That was hit home.
Yep.
Anybody else want to jump in with something? Mr. Begley?
Yeah, sure. I'll on 101, I read a few scenarios to consider that really gave me some perspective, right? These talk about imagine if or imagine having, right? So these were scenarios, and when you really start thinking about that, the book challenged me, I guess, to see things from a different perspective that I have no context for. I'll share this. I've often thought, in my day job, I often wear a suit. And when I'm out and about at lunchtime, let's say, and I'm in Home Depot, I feel like I'm treated nicer, with more respect, because I'm the only guy dressed in a suit, right? So if I've noticed and perceived that treatment based on what I'm wearing, I can imagine how a black person must feel based on their skin that can't be changed. right? They have to deal with all the time. And when you take, that hit me again, it was earlier in the book, but I went back to it. On page 92, she had a quote that really stuck with me. At the top of 92, "I personally do not have the luxury of ignoring racism because it doesn't ignore me." And that's 24/7, right? That's something that has to be dealt with.
Yep. Yep. And you're actually doing exactly what she says, or what she talks about, needs to be done. And so, one of the things that I think is that you're hitting on, it's basically imagining yourself outside of your normal being, just putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, and just kind of imagining what it is to not have the benefit of being the majority in the country and of being white. And I can definitely appreciate that. I think that was pretty important. That's a theme that comes through in her book, in this section. Yeah. So thank you for doing that. That's important.
Sure.
Anybody else?
I'll go next. I seem to have highlighted more of the action points of what needs to be done, and some experiences like the Uncle Bob thing. I think there's several Uncle Bobs in my life, from young to old, and something popped into my head years ago. My family was a member of the Monkees in Hamilton, and I knew it was mostly white guys. And we went golfing. My cousin and I went golfing. We brought Uncle, but we had an African man. He really was from Africa, and he came with us, and we sat down and did what we did. And I went to go to the restroom, and this guy followed me, and he said, "Can you come here?" And this was 30 years ago, and I didn't know the guy. I said, "Sure, what?" He took me out on the balcony. He goes, "So, what's going on? What you guys doing?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean? We're here, having some beverages and after golfing." And he said, "Well, what about your friend?" I said, "Who?" He goes, "You know who I'm talking about." And I said, "Are you talking about the black guy that's with us?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Is there a problem with that?" And he goes, "Well," I can't remember now exactly what he said, but I fumed inside. I was 25 maybe, and so I told him right then, long story short, and I'll get back to the book, is that, if that's the way this club is, I'm done. I went downstairs, tore my card up, threw it at the cashier, and I said, "Let's go, I'm out of here." And I said, "I hope all my family leaves this institution as well." That was probably the first time I ever experienced that. It didn't bother my buddy that was with me. I mean, he spoke broken English anyway, and I'm sure he felt weird, and that bunch of rednecks really is what that place is. But it really opened my eyes early to that, not to this degree. So let's move forward. Reading a lot of this in the last couple years, and some of the other nonprofits I'm associated with, my goal, or my verbiage, my commitment was for diversity. Whether it's black, Asian, more females, whatever it is to how do we do that? And there's several committees that meet, and we talk about that, and we're doing better, I think, that as a community. But I had somebody at coaching just the other day. He was telling me a joke, and I said, "Is that really necessary?" Or so another situation was talking about this, that, and there, and yeah, this black guy. I said, "Okay, what did that have to do with what you were telling me?" So it's made me more aware, and to be a little more bolder and intentional with sticking up, I guess, if that's the correct word. If it's not the right word, correct me. But being on that side, an ally, say, is that really necessary? If you say a joke and it's a white guy, why don't you say it's a white guy? Why do you have to point that out? So I think, doing more of that for me personally is a step for me. And one thing we talked about with Gina was on the other day is that individual taking steps will make a difference. Going out to a particular person, trying to seek them out for conversation, befriending, and trying to understand what they're going through. And we're not always going to understand it fully because we're not living it, but to be empathetic and to be a part of life and say, I got you. You know, let's do this together. And I think that's probably what I've taken from more of this than anything. On page 82, the six topics there: trust and speak, question broad, listen, understand, reject, shame, guilt. You know, those six I highlighted. Who's your Uncle Bob in your life? And then they will learn to wade through the anger on page 102 until they get to the source of it. That, you know, the anger part of that section was eye-opening a little bit as well. And then if I move to page 106, to be anti-racist, you must be introspective in the most common realization and understanding. But more than that, here it goes again, you must take action. So if we just keep talking about it, and this is what I said the other day, if we just keep talking about it, that's fine. But when do we put boots on the ground? When do we put action into what we're doing? So that's my commitment. You know, I teach ESL at our church, and my kids get to hang out with 40 different nationalities. They don't know any different. And I didn't know any difference really growing up. I wasn't surrounded with a different large group of ethnic people. But the custodian I talked about earlier was a black man that worked that was custodian at school, and he cleaned my dad's office. And they became friends, and we became friends. And I knew that man for all my life until he died, and he was a big part of my life. So it's taught. So we need to unteach it and teach the other way. I'm done.
Mrs. Gundry?
To sort of piggyback on what Mr. Clark said, that your last statement there, it's taught. One of my favorite sayings I've heard over the years is more is caught than taught. And, you know, like kids will pick up on how their parents act versus what their parents tell them to do.
Yeah.
But I also found the scenarios on page 101 really eye-opening. You know, as I was reading through them, I thought, well, yeah, I've experienced this one, and then there was a time I experienced this other one, but then at the end where they said, imagine if they were all part of your daily experience, I was like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. And I know I will never, like, understand, but like she says, I believe I'm further along in the journey than where I began, and I hope to keep moving further along in the journey. I found the part where she talks about listening to understand and not respond to be very interesting, because I know in my work frequently, you know, when I ask questions, I'm already thinking about the next question while they're answering instead of listening. And that made me sort of think where she says listen twice and, you know, talk once. I found that to be very interesting. And I tell you, the part that really stuck with me was the African proverb on page 114.
Yes.
The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. And wow, I mean, that is so accurate. I know with the work I used to do, you know, when I was dealing with at-risk kids, they often just felt so outcast and like they didn't have a place. And I found this to be so accurate, and that will stick with me. That's like one of my new favorite sayings, because it's so true. So, but I like this book. It was a hard read. It was emotionally kind of difficult to realize, like, oh wow, you know, I have so much to improve to help make things better. But I really enjoyed this, and actually I know I'm not following the prompts or whatever, but I wondered about some of these other books at the back, like how many of those I would find beneficial too. So, but thank you for this.
Yeah, I didn't find it hard to read, but I had to keep reflecting. This book made me reflect more than anything I've ever read before. And so I've always considered myself non-racist, but now I have to challenge myself to be anti-racist. And so, you know, I've often looked at things through a different lens just because of the experience I had in my upbringing. And, you know, I would say 2 years ago, I felt like I started being more self-aware of my surroundings and things that were going on in this world. And especially this past year, and then especially since we started reading these two books, you know, when they started talking about, I forgot what page it was on, but she started, I think it was part of the Black Anger, and she started talking about the Colin Kaepernick situation and how differently I saw that in the beginning. And it took a close friend of mine to say, well, wait a minute, you know, they have all this anger, and you're upset about exactly what she said in the book. You're upset about the way he's protesting, not that he's protesting. And, you know, the perspective I had was, you know, I've had, you know, very close friends that served in the military, and they might be offended. I never asked them if they were offended by that. I just assumed that people in the military would be angered that, you know, Colin Kaepernick was kneeling. In fact, when I did ask them, they're like, no, that's the respectful way. And then she talked about it in the book, like, when we lose a comrade in the field, we kneel, we take a knee. And so in a way, like, Colin Kaepernick was being respectful, and I think it talks about a friend of his or somebody came up to him and said that instead of sitting, it would be more respectful to kneel. And of course, we see athletes doing that now, and half the country is losing their mind over that. And in a way, it's like, you know, this is a peaceful way of them protesting. And so I think that we need to be more conscious of not being prejudicial towards the way people are protesting what they see in this world. And so you can't have it both ways. You can't say be respectful and be nonviolent, but then when they have a nonviolent protest, be critical of it. And so I'd already had those conversations with our family about a year ago, talking about, I think when the whole George Floyd incident happened and a lot of the unrest was going on, it made me come back and say, wow, I guess what Colin Kaepernick was doing, you know, was really the nonviolent way of protesting, you know. And so, and then to read that in the book last week, it's like, okay, I guess I was on the right track. So again, reading this book and the different, I've highlighted so many things in here. It made me realize that I'm not doing enough as a Christian to understand what good friends of mine are going through or have gone through and what I should be doing to make it better. And I'm going to make a commitment to try to get better every day, like Mrs. Gundrum talked about, and not being a non-racist, but being an anti-racist. And I think that starts with having uncomfortable conversations with family members, like Uncle Bob. You know, I've had some of those with some cousins and what have you. And I think that if each of us can make that commitment, it'll be better for everybody. So.
You know, and thank you so much for saying that, Mr. Birding, Mrs. Gundrum, Mr. Clark, Mr. Bagley. You guys are on your way to something that I think is very important that she's pointed out. And, you know, I think you're already there, and that's allyship. Allyship, you know, she talks about that, and she says that, believe it or not, you know, people need allies. I need allies. You know, it is hard. It gets difficult sometimes when you are the person of color and you're a woman in the room. And so when someone who is engaged in being an anti-racist sort of steps in and basically takes the weight or sort of carries, the ball for you so that you can kind of swing back, because you could easily be perceived as the angry, stereotype, and that is a heavy weight. So a part of the anti-racism goal is to be a true ally, and I can tell you 100%, allyship is so needed, and when you can kind of step in there and help out, because I get tired of the fight. I get tired. I've experienced stuff myself often, and so it sounds like you guys are just, you're right there, just, being allies, continue the work, continue to put that forward in the education environment and your personal relationships. It helps. The world isn't perfect, it never will be, but having true allies and true friendship does make a difference. I'm speaking from experience. It does make a difference. It makes it a little bit easier when things are really tough, and when you're just tired of the mantle of carrying, the shield.
Right.
So,
Well, she mentions that in there about her anger and talking on the phone, and
yeah.
she just blew up at that lady. And I mean, you can only take so much to a point, and maybe unintentional, but it was a breaking point for her. And
And there are times when you just want to scream, and there are other times when you just have to handle it the right way and just keep it inside, anti-blood pressure. But but just the idea of having someone who is willing to see where you are, empathize, understand that you're going through something, and they're just kind of willing to step up and just kind of help you with the battle a little bit. That means so much. And if we can get that out of the majority of, if we can get that out of enough people in the country, I think that would help a lot of people who are a part of the marginalized group.
Also, one last thing I'd like to add is the very last line before she got to acknowledgments, of the very last, I guess, paragraph, is as you dive deeper into the work of anti-racism, you will find that it is easier and easier to differentiate between being non-racist and anti-racist.
Yeah.
Your ultimate purpose should always be effectuating as much change as possible so that people of color have equal access to our society. And that was kind of the final push. I'm like, that's it. I totally understand, and I'm going to take that with me everywhere I go. And if I ever come into a situation where I just want to be a non-racist, I'm going to push myself into being an anti-racist. And so I thought that was a great thing that she left us with, that little paragraph. So anybody else want to, anything else that you'd like to add? Mr. Smith, Mrs. Lane?
Go ahead, Ms. Lane.
I got a bigger Post-it note than you. I just wanted to add one point, that when we talked about the Uncle Bob section of the book, one of the notes that I made was what causes the most change in its relationships. And I think that when I read that, it's like, oh, that's everybody in this school district should be forming relationships that'll help with a multitude of things. But I thought it was interesting that her comment about that causing the most change, and that's relationships. And that hit home with me, because that's what we stress all the time in our district. And that was just, like I said, one of the many things. Mrs. Shorter took a couple of mine. But I did also enjoy reading the book. Thought it was very good. And again, it makes you think and reflect and try to be that person, the anti-racist person now. So I enjoyed it.
Mr. Smith?
On page 83, some pretty powerful words. She talks about It's important to listen and trust other people's experiences. I've been in way too many conversations where I've shared my stories of facing racism and discrimination only to have the person try to deny or discredit what I'm saying. She goes on to say, and this is the part that's pretty powerful, I often have to remind people that my experience and their experience can exist in the same space. Just because you do not experience something does not mean that it does not exist. And it's so hard to get people to understand that. It's either, no, I'm right, or one of us is right and one of us is wrong. And that's just not how it is. It doesn't always have to be one or the other. But I feel like that's the way it is. A lot of times when we have these conversations, there are so many people that just don't want to be in that middle ground. They're not willing to listen. And that's hard to take. I as well, I think everyone mentioned page 101. And it talked about on 100 before you got to the 101. The best way is to personalize it. And that's what you're doing on page 101. Imagine if. And many people, myself included, we have a hard time relating to those scenarios because we haven't lived it. But you have to personalize it in order to start to understand it. And again, I know many of you talked about 101. The last part that I will share, the last piece, is on the very last page also, before the acknowledgments. And I think it was right after what Mr. Birding read. I believe in you. You can do it. But then the last part, I'm depending on you. And there are a lot of people depending on others to do this work and to be anti-racist. And don't forget that. That's a reminder for myself. People are depending on us. We should all be depending on each other to do this work and to speak up. But that's a powerful way to end this entire book. I'm depending on you. That's important.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Anybody else? Got anything? Well, Mr. Smith, thank you again for picking such an impactful book for us. I look forward to our next book, probably sometime in September usually, is that?
Yeah, usually. We'll put it on our to-do list this summer.
Okay.
No pressure.
No pressure?
And so far, we're 2 for 2. We've had some good
and
reads.
you've set the bar higher each time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Really makes us think. It makes us think outside of just gap credits, right? And GPAs and the academy. It's like it makes us think of the entire school district. So thank you so much for that.
You're welcome. And I share that responsibility. My first call is to Mrs. Aug. Hey,
all right.
What do you have any recommendations?
Well, great job.
And Gina, Ms. Gentry Fletcher has given me some recommendations, and so you just Google all these books and read all these reviews and see where we land. We'll do it again this summer.
Well, I know based on the conversations I've had at home, this will be out of my possession tonight when I get home, because I know Susan wants to start reading it right away. She's like, I want to read that. You've had some great conversations. Okay.
That's awesome.
So great job.
Thank you. All right. Our next 2 items for board discussion, Mr. Martin will be leading those conversations. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Martin. He'll be talking about a board policy and a board resolution. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, Mr. Birding, and members of the board. There's one board policy I'd like to present to you this evening. This is just to update the policy. The policy as it stands was written in 1995, so that's 26 years ago. Some language has changed since then, so we're just bringing it current with current law and current language. The policy has become more specific rather than less specific, And there are some dates in there that are different than the actual contract dates, but in here is the law. We can, like, one of the dates is when you're notified about something, but the date is okay for it to be earlier, it just cannot be later than that. And the way the contract is written, it is earlier than that. So the specifics are in there just to make sure that we're going to follow the law, but we have specified certain dates that are certainly okay because they're earlier rather than later. The language has just been strengthened. Now I sent you all an email talking about how our policies are going to look a little bit different. Now references, cross-references, and legal references are automatically updated by OSBA, and so we don't have to go through all of that. But there was a small title change to this, but this will bring this policy in accordance with law and update the language. Any questions about policy? It's CBC, CBD, it's superintendent's contract.
Any questions? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Martin.
All right. The next item is a resolution. It's been placed in your packet, and it's on here to be voted on later. This is a resolution that you passed last year when we entered the pandemic, and we realized that part of our board meetings, some members may not be present. We would be using Zoom. And at that time, the resolution we passed was to end on December 1st, 2020, but that has been extended. It will now end July 1st, 2021, and that's the only change to the resolution. So we just wanted to bring it back for you to approve. Any questions about the resolution and the change?
Any questions? No? Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.